All right, welcome. We're about to do a deep dive into the modern risk-based framework for costing contingent benefits. This is definitely for the advanced CP1 students, so let's get right into it. Okay, here's our roadmap for this session. We're going to start with the old school traditional costing, then unpack the big shift to the modern risk-based world. We'll look at profit testing, break down all the cost components, and then see how it all connects to pricing in the real market. And of course, we'll finish with a full recap to help you nail it down. So, first up, the traditional approach. You've got to understand this because honestly, its limitations are exactly why we do things so differently today. It really set the stage for everything that came next. So, what's the core idea here? Well, the traditional method essentially bundled everything together. The allowance for risk wasn't a separate line item. It was hidden inside the assumptions themselves. You'd use a mortality table that was a bit heavier than your best guess, or an investment return assumption that was cautiously low. The big problem with this? You couldn't actually see or quantify the capital you were holding for any specific risk. It was all just baked into the cake, totally embedded in the valuation. Okay, so that brings us to the modern risk-based shift. And this was a genuine paradigm shift, not just a small tweak. It was mostly driven by regulators who came in and demanded a much more transparent, much more scientific way of looking at capital. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. It's like night and day, right? The traditional approach was all about concealing capital in those prudent margins. The modern framework flips that on its head. Capital becomes this explicit, standalone number. It's calculated using your best estimate, and crucially, you have to directly charge the product for the cost of holding that capital. So why the big change? Well, the main driver was regulation, things like Solvency II. The rules basically said, no more hiding. You have to use a consistent best estimate basis for everything, for pricing and for reserving. And once you strip away those old implicit margins, what you're left with is an explicit pile of solvency capital. And that capital isn't free, right? It has an opportunity cost because you can't use it for anything else. The modern approach says you have to figure out that cost and build it right into the price of the product. So, this all sounds great in theory, but how do we actually do it? How do we implement this modern risk-based approach in the real world? Well, the number one tool in the Actuaries toolbox is the profit testing cash flow model. All right, let's look at a past paper question. This one gets right to the heart of it. It shows why these models are so incredibly critical for making real business decisions. This isn't just some academic exercise. This is about a company asking, if we cut our prices, what's going to happen to our bottom line? So, how would you nail this question? A top-tier answer would walk through this four-step process. First, you've got to model all your future cash flows, but with the new lower premium. Simple enough? Second, you discount those cash flows using a risk discount rate, or RDR. Now, the RDR is absolutely key. It's not just some random number. It's built up from the risk-free rate plus explicit additions for all the risks you can't diversify away. Things like market risk. It reflects what shareholders demand as a return. Third, you look at the resulting net present value and see if it meets your company's profit targets. And finally, and this is super important, you run scenario tests, maybe thousands of simulations, to see the full range of possible outcomes, not just one single number. Okay, let's pop the hood on these models and see what's really going on inside. This is where the devil is truly in the details, because every single one of these components has to be projected meticulously. You get one of them wrong, and the error can just cascade through your entire result. And wow, look at this. We have to project this entire universe of cash flows. It's not just the obvious stuff like premiums and claims. You've got investment returns, super detailed expense breakdowns, tax, and then the really critical bit for the modern approach, you have to explicitly model that initial cash outflow for the capital strain and then its eventual release when the contract ends. Let's just zoom in on expenses for a second, because they're so important. You can't just slap a single expense number on the model and call it a day. You have to analyze them by function and allocate them properly. So initial costs, like commission, are often a slice of the premium. Ongoing admin costs are usually a fixed amount per policy that goes up with inflation. And termination costs, well, they're typically a fixed fee per claim. Getting this allocation right is absolutely vital if you want to make sure the product actually covers its own costs over its lifetime. So beyond the core cash flows, you have these three big hitters. These are the major financial levers you can pull. Your investment strategy, for example, directly feeds your income assumption, and a higher return can let you charge a lower premium. Reinsurance is your main tool for transferring risk, and that premium is a direct cash outflow. And finally, back to the cost of capital. You absolutely have to model that initial new business strain, that big negative cash flow on day one when you set up reserves and capital, and its eventual release as a positive cash flow way down the road. Time for another past paper question. I love this one because it forces you to lift your head up and look beyond the spreadsheet. It reminds us that a model is only as good as the assumptions you feed it, and those assumptions have to come from the real world. And here we go. Our models don't exist in a vacuum. Every single assumption has to be tied to an external factor. For an enhanced annuity, you'd better have a solid view on demographic trends and longevity for that specific population. The economic climate, that's going to drive your investment returns and your expense inflation. Competition, that puts a ceiling on what you can charge and affects how many you think you'll sell. Regulation, social trends, you get the picture. Each assumption has to be a well-reasoned, justifiable view on what's going to happen out there in the world. Okay, so we've built the model, we've plugged in our best estimate assumptions. Now what? Well, this is the final stage. This is where the technical, scientific output from our model smacks right into the cold, hard reality of profit targets and a competitive market. The key thing to get here is that pricing isn't a straight line, it's a loop. It's an iterative process. So you run your model under thousands of scenarios. Then you check the results against your profit criterion. Something like, do we make a profit in at least 95% of these simulations? If the answer is yes, great, but you're not done. Now you have to do market testing. Is this price actually competitive? Will people buy it? And if you fail at either stage, if it's not profitable or it's not competitive, you go right back to the beginning. You have to tweak the product design, revisit your assumptions, and run the whole thing again. All right, our final question from the past papers, and it's a bit of a brain teaser. It highlights how these powerful, sometimes counterintuitive market forces can shape pricing in ways that your internal profit testing model might not predict on its own. So what's the solution to this puzzle? Well, it's the classic underwriting cycle. You know how this works. When the market is profitable, new competitors pile in, competition gets fierce, and rates get driven down. Eventually, things get unprofitable, companies start losing money, and they either leave the market or jack up their rates to survive. That starts the cycle all over again. In this recession scenario, the market was likely at the bottom of the cycle. Poor investment returns were probably forcing insurers to hike rates just to stay afloat. But at the same time, the recession meant less economic activity, fewer people buying cars, people driving less, so the total volume of premium being collected went down. It just goes to show the final market price is a mix of your technical price and these huge overarching market dynamics. Okay, deep breath. We have covered a ton of ground here, from high-level theory down to the nitty-gritty mechanics. So let's take a minute to consolidate all of it with a quick summary and some flashcards to really lock in this knowledge. So if you remember just one thing from this entire deep dive, let it be this. The whole story of modern costing is a journey from the implicit to the explicit. It's all about moving away from those hidden, bundled-in margins and toward a framework that shines a bright light on risk, quantifies it, and explicitly charges for the capital you need to back it. Okay, let's do some rapid-fire revision. First up, the core concepts. You've got to have these down cold. The difference between traditional and modern costing, what a best estimate basis is, the opportunity cost of capital, and of course, the underwriting cycle. And next, the key mechanisms. These are the tools of the trade. The profit testing model itself, the all-important risk discount rate, your company's specific profit criterion, and that final crucial step, market testing. And I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. After all this talk of sophisticated models, stochastic simulations, and detailed cash flow projections, how much of this is really a science, and how much is still an art? Because the final pricing decision often comes down to commercial judgment, a gut feeling for the market, and just knowing your competition. That balance, that's what makes this whole area so challenging and so fascinating.